Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL Week number 8 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. It's penultimate week time. We are 2 weeks away from the end of the regular season. We are 2 weeks away from playoffs, and we are 2 weeks away from knowing which two teams at the bottom of the standings will have to go back through the promotion tournament to potentially have a chance to play in the NACL again next year. You know, we'll see what ends up happening. I know that the format changes are definitely going to affect it in some way, shape, or form, so we'll see how that ends up playing out. But of course, a lot to play for with the Americas tournament again at the end of the year as well, and so quite a few things to be interested in, quite a few games to cover, some upsets to talk about this week, which is always fun. If you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. If you want to know my thoughts on the NACL up until this point, check out the playlist up in the iCard. Of course, that's where every single week of the NACL is overviewed and analyzed in the same format as you are getting in today's video. But I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. Let's go ahead and get right into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving my player of the series and my dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the week as well. And that's becoming more and more relevant. We're getting closer and closer to playoffs. These teams really need to start locking in. If I'm getting concerned about the upside of what a team could look like right now, that is really not a good place for them to be. Lucky for us, I think a lot of teams in the NACL are very scary and dangerous at the current moment. So we'll talk about that when we get into it. But without further ado, let's jump into day number 1. And we kick day 1 off with a pretty intriguing playoff, matchup. Two playoff teams here. Dragonsteel taking on Disguised. Both of these teams have already locked their spot in the playoffs, in the top 8, and Dragonsteel is going to continue their undefeated split here in day number 1, and they are 1 series away from going 9-0 in their 9 series, from potentially going 18-2 in those 9 series, and, just kind of cruising to a dominant regular season. They have clearly been the best team in the NACL. It's not even really been particularly close. Nobody has been even half as consistent as they have been. Shout out to Fear. They've been relatively close in terms of the consistency part, but Dragonsteel is just on a bit of a different level. Now, this might not be the DSG team that you want to kind of prop up in that same way. This isn't quite as big of a victory as the 4-3, 8-9 record would entail, because they do have some substitutions. Their AD carry, as we talked about last week, Tomo, has been promoted up to 100 Thieves. 100 T and DSG do definitely have kind of that pipeline, as you can see from a lot of former 100 Thieves and 100 Thieves Challengers players here on DSG, but they actually had to, basically have some emergency swaps. We'll talk about what they're going to do going into next week, but Brandini, a former coach of theirs, is going to be moving into the top lane because Tenacity, their top laner, is going to be moving down into the bot lane. Now, Brandini is a good player. He's played, professionally for a long time. He's somebody that has a lot of experience at this level. I'm not worried about Brandini. I'm significantly more worried about Tenacity playing AD carry, especially going into what is likely the best bot lane in the NACL now that Tomo is gone. It really was a concern for me, and honestly, that concern definitely kind of came to fruition. The bot lane for Dragonsteel really popped off in this series. Scary Jerry is the easiest player of the series that I could possibly give. This guy just wins so hard. When we were talking about him as a new player coming up into the NACL last year on Maryville, I was really high on him coming out of the collegiate and tier 3 scene, mostly because when you go and watch a lot of his tier 3 tape, the one thing that he never struggled with was laning phase. The 2v2 was always such a positive for both him and Zyko as players, and honestly, for me as an AD carry, that's kind of the thing I care about more at the current moment, is your ability to constantly win it. It's why I'm so high on Jan. It's why I've been so high on Jan ever since he first really showed up in the system, in Academy in particular, which I covered on this channel many, many years ago. But I think Scary Jerry kind of fits that mold. Tomo is another player that I think is just really good in lane, and that can solve a lot of weaknesses. If you're going into the mid game with leads a majority of your games, it doesn't really matter if you're awful in the late game, or at least it doesn't matter if you're, mediocre in the late game as much, because gold can do a lot for you in League of Legends, and Jerry kind of learned that, I think, last split. The problem now for the rest of the league is that Jerry seems to have gotten even better in the late game. Go watch his game 1 on Varus. This was a perfect late game team fighting performance from him on the Varus. Great positioning, great aggressiveness, just everything you would want to see out of somebody that's designated your primary carry in a comp like this, and I'm terrified of what Jerry can do. If this guy's playing in tier 2 next year, I'm gonna cry, because he is way too interesting of a prospect to not be in tier 1, in the same way that, Masu was way too interesting to not get promoted to FlyQuest. Now, do I think he's guaranteed to be, a top 2, top 3 AD carry like Masu is in year 1? I don't know. I think that there could be some learning curves that just weren't there for a player like Masu, but Jerry has the talent to be able to take over the LCS if he is given the right opportunity, and I think he continuously showed that, not only over the course of this series, but he's shown that over the course of this year. Zyko is also awesome. Huge fan of his. I've been praising him for quite a while on this channel. Basically, everything I said about Jerry applies to Zyko. If these two get separated, I'm going to be very sad. Both of them deserve LCS spots. They might get it on Dragonsteel here, depending on how the rest of the year goes. But the rest of this team is still great. Yuji was awesome, specifically on the brand, which is untouchable in game number 2. Zamudo, I thought was really good in this series, going up against Brandini, who played fine, generally speaking, was just playing tanks. Top side, he clearly was, someone that they were trying to protect at least a little bit in terms of the team comps, and Spyrax continues to be a player that I also find very underrated. I don't see him being talked about as the top 1, top 2 mid laner nearly enough for what I personally view him as, so Dragonsteel's really good. Do you need me to tell you that they're 8-0, they're 16-2, this team has been dominant. They are clearly the most dominant force in the NACL right now. And then for DSG, it's just really hard to kind of get any takeaways from this. Like, I think Young played pretty well on the Lucian in game number 1. He was awful, on the Corki in game number 1. He was awful on the Lucian in game number 2. I thought he played that game really poor. Tenacity wasn't horrid on the Smolder or the Zeri. He was not very good in lane at all. The 2v2 is really where the bot lane ended up struggling, which is why Poom is actually going to get my dud of the series here. I've always been a bit lower on Poom. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who's followed the channel over the last couple of years. I've just never really seen, the kind of upside that I think a lot of other orgs have seen in him. I think he's a good support, somebody that I was really excited to see back down at the tier 2 level because I thought it could help get his confidence back. That felt like something he was losing on CLG and even on 100 Thieves going back into those days, but it's just not really worked here. On DSG, I've not really been blown away by the performances, and especially with so many good supports in the NACL. I do feel a bit let down so far by Poom, but again, he has the talent to be able to bring it back. I just haven't really seen it, and I could say the same thing about Yukino in the jungle. I was really excited about Yukino coming back to pro, or at least coming back to tier 2 here. And he's another player that I think has just been okay for DSG. He's had some good games, he's had some bad games. I think the meta is just a bit more inconsistent, and that means players that are closer to the middle of the jungle rankings just aren't quite as dominant, and that's unfortunately the case for Yukino. I get that Yuji is likely the best player in the NACL at the current moment, but Yukino should be able to at least survive in these matchups, and I just don't think he's been relevant enough. I don't really want to comment too much on Brandini or Tenacity, mostly because they're not going to be playing moving into the future. It's been announced, and I can say this now because CCG didn't play this week, so there's no real reason to bring it up in their section, that they have found a bot laner, and it's going to be Manui. They're starting AD carry from the spring split. He obviously went over to CCG. He's been playing for them all split, but he's going to come back and play in the playoff run for DSG. It's very bad timing for CCG, who of course is attempting to make top 8. They are one of the teams that still is on the borderline that has not locked themselves in or out, and so quite a blow to them. They will be replacing Manui with Rockboom, which is actually fine. I think Rockboom's a good player, and especially on such short notice, it's a pretty good AD carry to be able to get and bring into that system, on such short notice. But DSG should hopefully be a little bit more consistent with Manui back in. It makes it a lot more similar to their spring team now that you've got a lot of these things going. It's basically just Yukino in there for parry, assuming Tenacity goes back into the top lane, which I'm like 99% sure is going to happen. So, hopefully DSG ends up, moving forward in a positive way. I've always been a bit lower on this team and what they've been able to do, but it's hard to really take any sort of analysis from this series when you're playing essentially with 2 substitutes. And then for Dragonsteel, again, they're the best team in the league. This isn't the hardest win they've ever gotten, but their final test is going to be next week against the number 2 team in Fear. If they're able to win that, going undefeated in the regular season would certainly set a bit of a tone going into the playoffs. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 1, and almost a pretty crazy upset happening here as we saw FlyQuest Challengers taking on AOE Esports, and Fly is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, but this is not a confidence-boosting 2-1 series win. You're facing the worst team in the league, the team that was 0-7 going into this series, and you just narrowly are able to walk out of Game 3 with a win. You look good in Game 1, I think that's definitely the encouraging sign, but Game 2, AOE was just kind of straight up better. They certainly were more clinical in the back half of the game. I think their comp ended up working out really well for them. And then Game 3, it was in AOE's hands. They just have to not get picked off by the Blitzcrank, and they just can't do it. Mobility without Flash ends up getting caught by the Blitz Hook. He dies in that final Elder Dragon fight, and the game is just instantly over, despite the fact that FlyQuest was behind the entire game. It was genuinely insane. Big ups to AOE. Obviously, this roster has gone through quite a few roster changes over the past couple of weeks. They've ended up settling on this 5, which I assume will be the final couple series of the year for them. with Cozy coming in the top lane, Onat coming back into the mid lane. The only player that is still here from the start of the year is Breezy in the support position, but you did make 2 more changes. City Witty has come into play jungle for this team. That seems like a lock here for the rest of the split. I like City Witty. I think he's a good player. Hasn't necessarily proven that he can be a great player at this level just yet. Was quite poor in his first run, but obviously that entire Team Liquid first team was a bit of a disaster, so I'm not going to blame him entirely. But mobility, a player that I feel significantly better about. This is somebody who probably should have had a starting spot in the NACL at the start of this split, considering just how he has played over the last year and a half in basically every competition that he has played in. But at the very least, he gets it now here on AOE, and he was very good in this series. We'll talk about him, but we have to start with FlyQuest. Player of the series, it's gonna go to Chime. I think you have to give this to one of the bot lane members, either that or Surdy in the top lane. They were the 3 players that really won FlyQuest this series. I just think Chime is unbelievable. He makes the game-winning play in game number 3, and maybe you can criticize the Nautilus at least a little bit in game number 2, but the Alistair was so good in game 1, the Blitzcrank was so good in game number 3. There's really not a lot of negatives that I can individually give him as a player. I just think he is so good in pivotal moments at understanding where he needs to be. He's a great roamer. He's a pretty good laner. He can kind of just do all of it. The fact that this guy, I know I say this every single week, and I'm probably sounding like a broken record at this point, but the fact that this guy, first of all, isn't playing in the LCS right now, but also that he probably won't play in the LCS ever again, that he is likely retiring after this split, it's just an absolute crime for the ecosystem as a whole to lose a player of his talent, because he could be on a top 3 or 4 team in the LCS right now. Like, he is good enough to do that. He will actively just straight up win games for his team at this level. He's the best support in the NACL, and it's not particularly close. Sajed was really good here. I've been saying Sajed because that's how I heard it when he first came into the league. If it's Sajed, I'm going to start saying that, just whatever. Let me know down in the comments what the technical correct pronunciation of it is. I'm going to call him Sajed here because that's what Mazel has been calling him on the cast, but Sajed was pretty good. I think especially in that game number 1 on the MF, he looked really solid. He was able to really control the laning phase. Some of those ultimates were really good, even if I do think Chime was setting up quite a few of them, but the Ziggs in game number 3 definitely, just needed to survive, just needed to be somebody that was there to help out the rest of the team and capitalize on what was created elsewhere. They were able to do that. Shout out Surdy, who I thought was constantly at least looking to try to make plays. He was definitely the better top laner in this series. I still want to see him be a bit more consistent, all things considered, but I can't really complain too much because he was a big reason why this series ended up going in favor of Fly. But the jungle mid, definitely a bit concerning. So much so that Bradley is actually going to get my dud of the series here. I really was not enthused by how Bradley played out this game. I thought the Aurora was clearly his best game in game number 1. The first Aurora that I've covered on this channel. The champion's actually kind of fun to cover in pro. We'll see if she ends up being ridiculously broken, but at least for now, she actually seems relatively well balanced and playable. And then Yone and Tristana for the second and third games. Those are the games that he's really getting dud of the series for. I don't think he played particularly well in either. I would argue that the Tristana in game 3 was actually really bad, and so I do think that that's kind of what he's getting it for. I haven't really loved how Bradley has played out a majority of this split. I do think he has, not necessarily made this team better. I think that their problems are a lot bigger than just Bradley coming in to replace Quad and that not necessarily working out. I think they have issues that aren't that, but it definitely is one of them, at least in my opinion. And Shaden also just needs to be a bit more clinical, a bit more aggressive in some of these games, but at least the bot lane was stepping up and doing what they needed to do in pivotal moments to win this series. And for AOE, for a ragtag group of players that had already been eliminated from being able to make playoffs, this was a pretty good output. They are the best team in the world in game 2s. We've said that basically over the course of this entire year. They have lost 8 series now of their, 8 series that they've played, and they've won game 2, I think in like 5 or 6 of those. It's genuinely absurd how good this team is in game 2 and how bad they are in games 1 and 3, but they probably should have won game 3. If it isn't for mobility getting caught out at the end of the game right around the Elder Dragon fight, they probably do end up winning that game, which is definitely a bit of a hard pill to swallow, but I think it's pretty encouraging from a team that really shouldn't be in this position in the first place. I was really impressed with both mobility and Breezy, and I think they have pretty good chemistry. We'll see if that ends up continuing. They only have one more series here, but, for promotion purposes, you hope that they can get on the same page. And then I think Onat has been a huge upgrade in the mid lane here. Cupid was definitely a bit more of a feast or famine player that was a lot more of one style. I think Onat's a lot more well-rounded individually. So City Witty looked fine. Cozy, I think, could have been a bit better, but looked generally fine, except on the Cassante, really, when he really needed to block those Blitzcrank hooks. But Overall for AOE, this is a good performance. You're going to walk out of this feeling better than you walked in, and for Fly, we've been waiting for this team to figure something out, to look more dominant, to not drop games randomly to teams that they have no business dropping games to, and yet we're still there. We're 1 week essentially away from playoffs now for them, and they can't figure things out on how to get to the right place. Obviously, I think this team could eventually get there, but at least for now, there are just so many question marks surrounding them. But then now moving on to day number 2, the second half of our week, and this is where the true upset comes into play. Man, am I excited to talk about this one. It's Team Liquid Challengers taking on Blue Otter, and Blue Otter picks up a ginormous victory. I cannot understate just how massive this is for Blue Otter to be able to get. Not only because beating Team Liquid is obviously great, not only because they've just beaten the 2 LCS-affiliated orgs in back-to-back weeks, beating FlyQuest last week, but now because they have put themselves in a phenomenal position to make the playoffs, a thing that seemed pretty unachievable over the past couple of weeks. Not unachievable, but unlikely for a team in Blue Otter that I just didn't see having a great, schedule towards the end of their run. I thought this was going to be a pretty difficult ask of them to get into the playoffs with the upsets that teams like Winthrop were able to pull off over the course of this split, or, CCG's wins that they were able to pick up against a lot of the bottom teams. It didn't feel like Blue Otter had the same kind of momentum going for them at the end of this split. But here we are 2 weeks later, and they're sitting at 3-5, and they control their own destiny at this point. They might even be locked for playoffs by the end of the week, depending on what happens in our final series that we'll cover in just a minute. But the fact that it's even in their hands in the first place is pretty insane. It genuinely is crazy. This wasn't just a win, it was a 2-0. They didn't drop a single game to Team Liquid. For TL, this team that I've continued to say is probably going to be better than we're giving them credit for, continues to maybe kind of prove me wrong here. I don't really know how to feel about Team Liquid, because once again, this is an org that kind of does this a lot, where in stretches they'll look really good, and for the most part, that stretch does include playoffs, and they almost always step up and play well in those best of 3s and those best of 5s when they really matter. But this is not looking good. They're below 500, not only in terms of series score, but in game score as well. They're 10-11. This has not been a particularly successful team in terms of results, and so you're hoping that the good parts of them can actually materialize a little bit more in the playoffs, but at least for now, there are real concerns. For Otter, Player of the series could go to quite a few people on this team. This really was a team effort. I think all 5 members of Blue Otter played excellent in this series. I'm going to give it to Levitate for the Zeri in game number 2. He just was the focal point for where this team wanted to put a lot of their resources. They relied a lot on the Zeri to be able to win a lot of their late game 5v5s, and Levitate came in clutch. He has been awesome over the course of this split. You can to say what you want really about Blue Otter's consistency in a lot of different lanes. I think Quacker has had a couple of bad performances. Music, even Rovex at times has not been perfect. Samikin wasn't particularly great last week, but Levitate has kind of been the constant, the thread that has tied Blue Otter together over the course of this split. And when especially you're getting the rest of the team playing as well as they did here, this is a scary team to run into. Music was awesome. The brand was great in game number 1. He was super efficient on the Sejuani in game number 2. Samikin gets his Zoe in game 2, kind of his signature champion, his pocket pick, if you will, and he looks awesome. I think outside of last week, essentially, he has been probably Blue Otter's best and most consistent player. So it's nice to see him continue to play well, even when the resources aren't going as much his way. Rovex, I think, has been really good over the course of this split. I'm a big fan of Quacker. I've been singing his praises since the Supernova days, a couple of splits ago, but he was great in side lanes on, tanks like Udyr and Zion, and, making sure that his team was set up well. Having 3 combined deaths on those champions is not easy, so Blue Otter looking really good. I'm just really happy to see this. They're peaking at the right time, and depending, again, on what happens later on this week, they could have already locked themselves in for top 8, which would be massive to stay in the NACL for another split. And then for Team Liquid, I don't know what to tell you. This team is collapsing at the exact wrong time. The players are still playing relatively well, but you're getting 1 or 2 per series that are just kind of underperforming. It's not always the same players, but there always are players that are going a little bit more up and down than maybe you would expect. In this series, the good players, Roamer, I thought he was really good, especially on the Ezreal in game number 2. Not exactly the easiest champion to pilot at the current moment, as we've seen from a lot of other mid laners, but Roamer made it look really strong, and quite frankly, he was the big reason why Liquid was even close in that second game. I think Jenkins continues to, at the very least, be active on the map, even if not everything he's doing is perfect. And I don't think Spawn's losing the game for his team, but one of the players that I've really been praising a lot over the course of this split in Keel, I thought really was kind of a negative in this series. He kind of just got completely out-jungled by Music, who was a lot more active and certainly was a lot more efficient than what Keel was on the other side. I've been praising his ability to kind of adapt. Obviously, this meta is kind of perfect for him. He loves those AP carry junglers, but the Rumble in Game 2 didn't look great. The Lilia, something that's worked super well at this level, not great in Game number 1, so definitely something to keep in mind, but dud of the series for me is going to go to Kim Down in the support position. It's just very rare to watch an NACL support get super far behind in the early game on Leona and still be effective. It's just a very difficult ask, especially in this meta. I know I drive this point home in a lot of the regions that I cover, but support is harder to play right now, in my opinion, than has been in many years. I think that you're asked to do a lot more. You don't just have to be good in lane. You don't just have to be good at roaming. You don't just have to be able to fight and protect in team fights. Like, you have to do everything as a support, and I think that it's just a little bit more of a hard job, I would say, at the pro level right now than it has been basically since like 2017, 2018, like that era. So we're seeing a lot of supports either really step up and look awesome or, maybe not be as consistent. And I don't think Kim Down has been as consistent as he normally is over the course of this split. So for Team Liquid, again, there are concerns. Like, on the Rift, it's really hard not to be concerned about the way that this team plays and their inability to actually stay consistent in these team fights in the late game. I think it's really hurting them. But it's Team Liquid. You have to assume that at least at some point, this coaching staff that has notoriously always gotten the best out of their players is going to be able to do that with a pretty good roster. So, it's kind of a wait-and-see approach, but it certainly is a lot of waiting at the current moment because we're not seeing anything. And then for Blue Otter on the other side, this is ginormous. Again, I can't overstate just how big this win is, not only for their chances, but for their confidence and for the mental of this team. They kind of were getting kicked around a lot in the middle of the season. Not that they were losing super hard, just that I can see that being incredibly demoralizing. I could see why some of those losses you might walk away from them being like, man, we probably should have had that one. Like, a lot of close series, and for them to be able to walk out of the last 2 weeks 2-0 after facing two of the scariest teams in the NACL, it's a ridiculous outcome, and you've got to be excited for them. And then moving on to our second series of day 2 and our final series of the week here, and a pretty important one for playoff qualification. We could be seeing our 7th team get locked. And we will be seeing that, as we saw Winthrop University taking on Supernova, and Supernova picking up the 2-1 win. You might wonder, okay, well, Supernova was already locked for the playoffs, so what do you mean we're going to be seeing another team locked in here? Well, with Winthrop losing in their final series of the year, as they do not play next week, Blue Otter is now officially locked for that number 7 playoff seed. They could get number 8, but at the very least, they are guaranteed top 8 with their series and game score. Huge for Blue Otter. That's a massive outcome for them, but we'll talk about them at the end of the video. Let's talk about Supernova and let's talk about Winthrop, because this was an insane series. I have to imagine this is the bloodiest series of the NACL so far this year. Game 2 might be the bloodiest game. I mean, 66 total kills in game number 2, genuinely absurd, but it's not like it slowed down in games 1 and 3. Like, just a crazy output from both of these teams. You can see it in the score lines. I mean, on the losing side, you've got a 22, 18, and 34 jungle. You've got a 23, 16, and 25 mid laner. Like, this was just an unbelievable series in terms of aggression, in terms of confidence, and you gotta give Winthrop a lot of credit. They certainly tried, but Supernova was just a tad bit more clinical, a tad bit better down the stretch. Player of the series was super easy to me. It's gonna go to Toasty in the mid lane. I've been very impressed with Toasty over the past year, ever since he, came up with Fear and was really given that opportunity. He has made the most of it. He was awesome with Fear last split. He's been awesome with Supernova this split. I just like him a lot as a player. I think we could be looking at Toasty next year as the best mid laner in the NACL. I think that that's a pretty realistic thing to potentially try to see in terms of his development. There have been a lot of really interesting young, endemic North American mid laners to come through this system. Not a lot of them have been able to make their way to the top of these rankings. I think Toasty is certainly talented enough to be in that conversation, but the Zeri in game 2 was dominant. I mean, easily the most dominant game of the series. And then the Azir in game number 3 was also great. I mean, he wasn't maybe the main carry. I mean, Lens was awesome in that third game, but the Azir was very close. And I think you could even make a case that for times Toasty was the best player in game number 3. And so this was a pretty easy choice for player of the series, but you got to give credit to basically everybody else. I thought Lens and Diamond were excellent here. Diamond with some phenomenal setups. He's one of the best supports in the NACL. Lens was great. I think he is hitting his stride really at the right time for this team. Not that he has really been bad at all this year, but just that he's kind of been good and not great great. He has been great over the last couple of weeks in terms of the output that he's able to get out there. I wish the Caitlyn Lux game was a tad bit better in game number 1. I think that's really the only critique I have for Supernova's bot lane, but Lens and Diamond looked good. I think Kenvi was a little bit over-aggressive at parts in this series. I think the Sejuani in game number 1 was not great. The Maokai and the Vi were definitely better, though. In games 2 and 3, Faisal continues to be one of the best top laners in the NACL. It's just a really fun Supernova roster. I continue to not really know where to put them. They've kind of been stuck at the number 5 spot in my power rankings for quite a long time. They might be moving up this week because they just continue to overperform what my expectations for them are. We will have to see. But for Winthrop on the other side, this is a heartbreaking loss. Obviously, this doesn't eliminate them from playoffs, but this is their last series of the year that they get to play, at least in terms of the regular season. Next week, whether or not CCG wins or loses is going to determine whether or not Winthrop ends up making the playoffs. Lucky for them, CCG is a pretty hard matchup, but to have it taken out of your hands like that, it's just not ideal, especially with the amount of upsets that they've been able to pull off over the course of this split. Dud of the series is unfortunately going to go to Skytech in the support position. This feels incredibly unearned. I want to make that abundantly clear. I didn't have a good choice for this across the entire series. There really was nobody that was bad in all 3 games. I would say everybody was good in at least 2 of the games, whether that be games 1, 2, or 3. You can pick 1 where they were probably bad and then 2 where they were probably good. That does apply to Skytech. I think for the most part he was very active and very good on the map. He just wasn't quite as clinical in their losses as he maybe should have been. I'm not the biggest fan of the output that he's put out over the course of this split, but I really think this is one of his least deserved duds of the series. I think Aaron was too good in game number 1 for me to really consider him. Winnie I thought had a pretty good series, all things considered. Denethor, might have been in the conversation, but the setup was actually really solid from him. I thought Darkwings was generally fine, maybe outside of that third and final game on the Tristana. There were generally just a lot of moments from everybody else in this team that maybe say, I just can't justify giving them dud of the series, and that means Skytech does end up getting it, but I really want to make it clear that I don't think Skytech was bad at all. Somebody just has to get this award, and it unfortunately went to him. But for Winthrop, again, the main conversation, the main topic that they are going to be thinking about coming out of this series is we had it in our hands. We had the ability to control our own destiny, and it just didn't happen. They had the chance to lock themselves into the playoffs here, and they couldn't quite do it. Now, whatever happens next week is obviously great, but if this is the last time we see this Winthrop team in the NACL, it's going to be a bit disappointing. I think these players actually played relatively well. I'm a big fan of Aaron in particular. I think he is a really, really fun young AD carry on this team, and I hope to see him in the NACL more in the future, but we'll just have to wait and see what the fate of Winthrop ends up being. For Supernova, obviously, this is a nice win. 5-3 is actually a pretty good record going into the final week of the season. We'll see what ends up happening, but seeding is pretty important for the NACL in particular, with so many teams being kind of different in terms of skill levels. Getting one of those top 2 or top 3 seeds might be more important than ever, so Supernova definitely wants to keep their foot on the gas, but at the very least now, it feels like they're playing some of the best league they've played all year. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 8 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen, the updated standings. After 8 weeks of action, we've only got 1 remaining. Some teams are already done, so we've seen a lot over the course of this split, but technically not everything is determined just yet. Of course, all of the teams are going to be listed 1 to 10. I will continue to sort them based off their game score, because I do believe that's how seeding works for the playoffs, and so some ties that you might see on the actual Leaguepedia version of these standings, I'm not having them as ties. They have different game scores, and I assume it will be broken that way. You can see my power rank. Next to every single team is going to be a number. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Of course, change is how they have changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers. 1, 2, 3 are going to stay the same. I should also note any team that's highlighted in green, they have officially qualified for the playoffs. As you can see, Blue Otter qualifying at number 7. Everybody else had already made their way in last week. Blue Otter is the only new addition to this list, but congrats to them. And just the same as last week, AOE is still the only team that officially cannot make the playoffs. At 0-8, that's not really a surprise, but definitely still something to note. We've got 1 more spot open, and it will be fought over by CCG and by Winthrop. And that entire situation is coming down to basically 1 series in next week, and that's going to be CCG taking on FlyQuest Challengers. Obviously, Fly is going to be favored for that, but they've not exactly looked untouchable over the past few weeks. I think CCG could theoretically get something in there. I think they are better than Winthrop, but I'm not sure the schedule is going to work out in their favor. Depending on how things go, they can make it They really only make it with a win, actually. Now that I'm looking at it in terms of game score, if they lose 2 games, they're going to be sitting at 15 losses. That's going to be a worse percentage than Winthrop, regardless. And so they need to win next week over FlyQuest in order to make it, at least as far as I am aware. But the other power ranking changes, I've got Supernova moving up to number 4. Team Liquid is going to fall to number 5. Supernova looks pretty good right now. They've looked better over the course of the last few weeks, and Team Liquid has looked worse over the course of the last few weeks. Do I think this will last for the playoffs? I'm really not sure just yet. I don't have the most confidence in Supernova, and I don't have the least confidence in Team Liquid, so we'll end up seeing, but at least for now, it felt like inevitable to make that, like I had to make that change. I couldn't sit there and be like, Team Liquid right now is better than Supernova, because they aren't at the current moment, but DSG is going to stay at number 6. I just want to see what this team does, at least for now. Like, they are the biggest question mark of the big 6, in my opinion, right now, and I just don't really know where they're at. We'll see where they're at with their new roster, but it's a lot of question marks for DSG. At the current moment, Blue Water is going to move up to number 7. They're better than both CCG and Winthrop. They have beaten 2 very good teams over the past few weeks, and they might actually be able to upset some other good teams, you know, in the playoffs, depending on how things end up going. And then CCG, Winthrop, both moving down 1. Like I said, I think CCG is the better team. I'm not sure it's actually going to matter. And we don't really know how CCG is going to play. Remember, they're also making a roster change with Rockboom coming in to replace Manui. So we'll see how things end up working out. Of course, AOE stays at number 10, but let me know if you agree or disagree with my power rankings down in the comments section below. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 8. Player of the week, no shock here. It's going to go to Scary Jerry, the AD carry for Dragonsteel. This team is just ridiculous. They're 8-0. They're 16-2. They cannot really be beaten under any circumstance at the current moment, and Jerry is a big part of that. He is a player that was coming into the league as a one-dimensional player and has grown into somebody that I think could be an all-around great here in North America, at the LCS level even. He has been awesome. You know, this is the point of the NACL. Players like Jerry, to me, are a prime example of why this league matters so much, to watch a player continue to grow and develop and become one of the best in the league, not just be one of the best in the league or not be one of the best in the league from the start. Watching that development has been a lot of fun. The honorable mentions, the runner-ups this week, Levitate, the AD carry for Blue Water. Crazy win for Otter, and Levitate played amazing. He has been great over the course of this whole split. Glad to finally be able to give him some recognition. And then Toasty, the mid laner for Supernova, also really freaking good this week, and Toasty is just generally somebody that I've praised a lot on this channel in terms of his ability to carry games, and so not a surprise there to see him, but Toasty, Levitate, they are my honorable mentions. Jerry is going to get my player of the week, and then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Kim Down, the support for Team Liquid Challengers. Just not a very good week for Kim Down. I didn't think he played particularly well in his series, and honestly, I don't think he's been that great over the course of this split. Him and Spawn have been a pretty inconsequential bot lane. When Liquid wins, it's often through the top side of the map, be it Jenkins or Keel or Roamer. It's definitely one of those 3 that is typically winning games for this team, and I've honestly been pretty underwhelmed by what Team Liquid's bot lane has been doing. Hopefully they're able to get back on the right track, but right now it's just not looking all that interesting for me when it comes to either Spawn or Kim Down. So Kim Down's going to get dud of the week, and Jerry is going to get player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week. Playoffs are around the corner for basically every region. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially with Worlds coming up, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.